afternoon, everyone. This is Jen Morrow with Bard's Alley Bookstore in Vienna, Virginia, and I want to welcome you to today's event and say hello to our author guests, Donna Hemans and Kelli Jo Ford. And I first wanted to start by welcoming the audience members and let you know you will have an opportunity to ask questions. When we get to that point, use the chat feature, please, and we will moderate the questions and give you a chance to talk to our authors. So I first wanted to thank George Mason for doing these events and give you a little introduction, background of our two authors, and then we're going to hear from them, let them read a little bit from their books. So Donna Hemans, she is the author of Tea by the Sea. She was born in Jamaica and also author of the novel River Woman, winner of the 2003 and 4 Towson University Prize for Literature. Tea by the Sea, for which she won the Lignum Vitae Una Marson Award for Adult Literature, is her second novel. Her short fiction has appeared in The Caribbean Writer, Club Orchard Review, Witness, and the anthology Stories from Blue Latitudes, Caribbean Women Writers at Home and Abroad, among others. She received her undergraduate degree from Fordham University and an MFA from American University. She lives in Greenbelt, Maryland. Welcome, Donna. And Kelli Jo Ford, she is our other author, Crooked Hallelujah. She's a citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. She is a recipient of numerous awards as well, and fellowships, including the Paris Review's Plimpton Prize, the Everett Southwest Literary Award, the Catherine Bakeless Nason Award at Breadloaf, a National Artist Fellowship by the Native Arts and Cultures Foundation, and Adobe Paisano Fellowship. Her fiction has appeared in the Paris Review, Virginia Quarterly Review, Missouri Review, and the anthology 40 Stories, New Writing from Harper Perennial, among other places. Welcome, Kelli Jo.
Thank you, Jen.
Hi. So I'm going to go ahead and let Donna start with the reading from her novel, Tea by the Sea. And please take it away, Donna.
Okay, thanks, Jen. So Tea by the Sea is a story about a young mother who spent 17 years searching for her child who was taken from her at birth. And I'm going to read two short sections. So Plum goes back and forth between Brooklyn and Jamaica to find her child. And the first section takes place when her daughter is about 8 years old and she thinks she has figured out where the father is with their child. 8 years of active searching had come to this: an abandoned house, an outdoor stove and a doll, signs of a former life, but not necessarily his and hers. No trace of where Lenworth and her daughter had gone. No trace even of the girl's name. There was no telling how long the house had been empty. Weeks, months, years. She wouldn't cry. Instead, Plum forced her disappointment deep within and buried again the words she had practiced for her little girl. There was no use in waiting, but Plum waited anyway on the veranda, her arms on the railing, her eyes trained on the hill and the roof of the house in the valley below, her body like that of a woman expecting her family or visitors to appear any minute at the bottom of the hill. Clouds shifted in and out. Smoke rose from an outdoor fire near the house below with the rusted zinc roof. Goats let loose in the morning bleated as they made their way back home. Only when the sun was nearly down did she leave, weaving her way back down the hill in the shadows of the large breadfruit and star apple trees, and back down the long hill past Reading, through the city of Montego Bay and onto a mid-sized hotel in Iron Shore. She took with her the one-legged doll and an unconvincing conviction that her search would end right there at the house in Anchovy. She had come up empty too many times, and each time she walked away empty-handed, she relived that first night, waking to find her baby gone, coming home to a house that was no longer hers, feeling again like a castaway abandoned at the first sign of trouble. So I'm going to jump forward a few more years, and this section takes place in Brooklyn. Brooklyn, East 33rd Street. The air was a little bit cooler and smelled of rain. Plum-polished windows, both the inner and outer sides of the glass, with a crumpled newspaper and a mixture of vinegar, lime, and water. She whistled, thinking at the same time of the uselessness of her chore, polishing the exterior windows when rain had set up to fall. But she didn't stop, simply moved her arms like a wound-up doll powerless to stop itself. Behind Plum were her girls, Nia and Vivian, 7-year-old twins, one doing cartwheels, the other watching. Both girls lingering really and waiting for Plum to finish and turn to them. They were clingy girls, or perhaps it was the other way around. Plum was an overprotective mother, preferring to have her girls with her, underfoot, within reach. Except for work, she didn't leave them. All these years, she hadn't been able to shake the fear that her girls wouldn't be there when she returned. But they were there. Nia, the acrobatic one, contorting her body through the air, and Vivian, a quiet observer with a book on her lap, stealing glances at Nia. Nia took risks. Vivian weighed consequences. Together, the girls balanced each other, and often, when Plum imagined them older as teenagers, she saw Nia treating life like a tightrope and Vivian holding the net beneath her sister. Even if Alan had been home at that very moment, the girls would still have been nearby waiting for her to finish and turn to them. Nia stumbled and crashed, and Plum turned to see her sprawled on the hardwood between the coffee table and the couch. Water from a cup pooling, magazines from the rack scattered on the ground like shattered glass, and the storage bench flipped over on its side. You all right? Where did you hit? Did you hit your head? Nia, giggling instead of talking, looked at her sister and the pool of water spreading fast toward the rug. Vivian laughed too, their laughter loud, uncontrollable. Plum moved her daughter's shoulders and arms, watching for a wince, waiting for a shiver of pain, but again got only uncontrollable giggles. Enough of the cartwheels. She was trying to flip onto the bench and back down, Vivian said. Enough. Plum hadn't heard their discussion at all, hadn't heard the usual watch me. Plum shook her head, moved towards the spreading pool, newspaper in hand, and layered it on top of the water sheet by sheet, and drew her breath. It was a hiccup, really. She looked again, closer this time, back bent, water dripping from one half of the newsprint. She ripped the sheet in half, dropped the wet half to the floor, then moved toward the window, sheet in hand for a closer look in the natural light. Unmistakable. Lenworth. She hadn't forgotten the face, the half smile, the thick brows, the thin nose. Below the photo, a caption with his name and his title, Priest. Unmistakably him. Thanks, and I'll stop there.
Thank you. Kelli Jo.
Sure, I would love to read, Donna. That was wonderful. So I'll just read, I think I'm going to read from a story that takes place in the first third of the book. It's called The Year 2003 minus 20. And I said story and not chapter because Crooked Hallelujah is a novel in stories. And it follows Justine and Renee, who are a Cherokee mother and daughter, who, as they move from eastern Oklahoma's Indian country, that is the Cherokee Nation, to North Texas, trying to start a new, better life. It's during the oil bust of the 1980s, so it doesn't really go as Justine, the mother, wants it to. There will be hints of this, I think, in this little section, but really it's a story about 4 generations of women from this family. And in great part, a story about faith as well, as they come from a really fundamentalist Christian church. This is in the middle of the story. I'll just jump right in. This is, they're still in the Cherokee Nation here. They have not moved, but the time is coming soon. Okay. A good time crew from the factory drifts in and out of the house. Cigarette butts transform ashtrays into morning after volcanoes. Renee turns the ash-dusted tabletops into canvases, tracing hearts in her path when she creeps to the kitchen in the morning quiet. Men, some with union money to spare, bring occasional gifts, a bone-handled jackknife, a book of knots, the licks of a bobtailed dog. They fill the house with noise and a sweet-smelling smoke that Renee has come to know. They leave behind safety glasses, a stray sock here or there. One leaves the Waylon and Willie record that Renee keeps stashed beneath her bed. If being with my ex taught me anything, Justine says, it's take not 1 ounce of shit from a man. Justine, who won't call Kenny by name anymore, holds her eyeliner to the flame of a match to soften it before touching it to her eyelid. Renee leans in the doorway, waiting for the familiar sermon. You can't trust a man to take care of you. Remember that, Renee. You can't trust them at all, for that matter. They'll lie to get what they want, and they always want something. Justine steps over Renee and disappears into the kitchen. She's going to work tonight at the second job she's picked up, waiting tables at the Cowboy Bar. Justine walks back in with a shot glass of tequila. I wish you wouldn't go to that job, Renee says. The low-cut blouse Justine has to wear makes Renee feel equal parts angry and embarrassed. I wish Granny and Lula didn't have to walk to the laundromat, but wishing won't get the washing machine out of layaway. Justine does a little shake with her hips, holds up the tequila, and winks at Renee. Renee digs through Justine's purse and finds the lemon-shaped squeeze bottle and disposable salt shaker. She passes the salt and squeezes a bit of lemon into her own mouth before handing it up to Justine, who has already licked the back of her hand. I go and prepare a place for you, Justine says, before giving the salt a shake and drinking the tequila down. She cackles, then gets mock serious. Maybe, Renee is not sure. Says, Father, forgive me. Kenny seemed good-natured enough until he didn't. After him, men all ran together in Renee's mind. There could have been 1 or 10. There was the one who traveled around sharpening barber's razors and scissors and prided himself on keeping the kitchen knives sharp. There was the rodeo clown with the sweet dog and his own bag of makeup. Then there was the one whose friend owned the bar where Justine worked. This one wore a .38 special in a holster he clipped to the inside of his cowboy boot. He had a long red ponytail and plenty of money, but no job. After Justine ended it the first time, he stood at the bottom of her bedroom window crying and strumming a guitar. The second time, he snuck into her locker at the plant and filled her purse with poison ivy. Renee doesn't know what her mom is looking for in the men or nonstop working. She doesn't know what makes her squeeze Renee so hard and so long sometimes that it seems like all the air might leave Renee's chest for good. What makes her sit up all night watching Renee sleep some nights and stay up making noise with the good time gang others. Renee doesn't understand what makes it so hard for her mom to keep still. As far as she can tell, they don't need much at all. And between the one job and Granny and Lula, they have all they might ever need in the world.
Excellent. Thank you.
Of course.
I wanted to start our conversation kind of going back to the title of this event, which is In Search of What Is Lost. And, for me, in Tea by the Sea, clearly Plum is always looking, for what is lost. And also in Crooked Hallelujah, I think many characters, maybe they don't know what they lost, or what's lost, I think, in both novels is possibly what a different future could have been. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, how close am I in that kind of observation? Kelli Jo, could you talk, since you're talking about the 4 different generations, could you talk a little bit about that theme and searching for what is lost?
Sure. I agree with you. I think that, especially talking about Justine, who had Renee when she was 16, and as a result of a sexual assault from someone she knew, I think that what's lost is that she couldn't even identify what was lost because she never got a chance to know. Even before that happened, they were living in poverty once her father left, and her mother was dealing with mental illness. So Justine was in a position of not really having much of a childhood due to those circumstances. And then when she finds herself pregnant at 15, she has this moment where she's been rebelling against her mother's very strict religion. And she has this moment where she just sort of runs away. She can't bear to tell her grandmother or her mother that she's pregnant. And she runs to a creek, and there she kind of breaks down. And it's one of the few times we see her break down because she's so hardened over the course of her life. But there she's crying out to God, this God that from a religion she's rejecting, for the one of the only times saying basically, I don't deserve this, I'm just a girl. But from there on, she never really, she just sort of like hardens and grits her teeth and bears it. And I think the opportunity to experience pain and heartache, like as much of it as she feels, is closed off to her, because she feels like she's got to raise this daughter now and give her a better life, which she does. Yeah, but I think there's so much that's lost to her that she wouldn't be able to identify. And I'm talking mostly about Justine because for me, she is, as a writer, and now thinking about the story, trying to step away from the story. For me, she's kind of it's about the 4 generations, and especially about this mother and daughter, Justine and Reed. But really, I think to me, Justine's at the heart of the story. It's her progression of trying to give her daughter a better life.
Right. Thank you. And Donna, would you just talk a little bit too, where kind of how you're formulating Plum and what, kind of her search.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think Plum's search is 2-part. I mean, certainly one, the biggest search is finding her daughter, and also finding Lenworth, who was taken off with her child. And but I think that in addition to that physical search itself, there's so much else that she's looking for. One of the things that we learn about Plum early on is that her parents sent her back to Jamaica when she was a teenager to go to school or to finish her education there. Largely, they wanted her to stay out of trouble in Brooklyn. She goes to Jamaica and she finds a whole different kind of trouble there. But one of the things that lingers for her is that she felt abandoned. She felt that her parents pretty much sent her away and abandoned her. And the same thing happens when, after she has a child, Lenworth takes her child from the hospital and he runs away and he abandons her too. So the search for her is to find a place where she will be accepted, she will be wanted. And that's one of the biggest things when, later on when she does find Opal, one of the questions that, she has to ask is whether or not Opal will reject her also. But, the other question to her that, she really wants to find out is why Lenworth took off with her child. So on the one hand, there is that search for Plum's search is present, but Lenworth also has a search of his own because there was something that was taken from him as a child, which in some ways, he lost the opportunity to have his education fully paid for. And so he has had to go off and be something else. And there is for him this search to be accepted, this search to be a full person, even without the career that he thought he was going to have, or that I guess in some ways was owed to him.
And I found it really interesting how you saved, I don't know if saved is the right word, but we didn't really find that much out about his background until quite far into the book, when we learned of, when you talked about the culture and, that when he was sent away. Was that intentional?
Yeah, I say yes, it was intentional. It's, I think every writer has to balance how much of the story you tell at the beginning. When does the reader get to know it? And how does the information that the reader gets really affect how you view that particular person? And I think, certainly from the very first page, I think you would absolutely hate Lenworth. But as you grow, as you continue through the story and you learn a little bit more, I think you have to take a step back and think about whether he was truly being just this selfish bastard or what else was there that had pushed him in that direction. And I think for all of us as human beings, I think we go through moments like that where we think that some people are, just the very worst. But once we begin to understand a little bit more of where they're coming from, I think their actions sometimes take on a very different, it feels different. Not all the time, but sometimes. But I think that, it helps to have a better understanding of what people are going through. And that's one of the things that I wanted to do with Lenworth, is to really make sure that we had a good sense of not just his actions, but what was behind what he actually ended up doing. It may not have been the best thing. I mean, I could think of other approaches that he could have taken, but there was, a significant reason behind it.
No, I really, I think that settled more things for me, just like kind of at the end, it was a very hopeful ending, and just beautifully written book. And Kelli Jo, when I was, reading, there's two observations, but the first I'm going to say is about the moving between, Oklahoma and, Texas, and, kind of the way that you would bring in the environment and the weather and the, just kind of the troubles, like having to deal not just with survival, but kind of the area itself of where they were living. And I just wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about kind of that part of the, it's a spiritual journey, but also like physically moving, trying to catch up with something or escape something, and how that played into the novel.
Sure. Yeah. And the characters are really, once they leave Oklahoma, which feels like a matter of survival for Justine, in the passage I read talking about the boyfriend from Reenie's point of view when Reenie is about 8. Even in that short passage, it introduced some of the danger of the man with the gun and the ponytail and the poison ivy in the locker. So Justine left everything she knew and her real anchor as an act of survival. And in doing so, she also took away Reenie's anchor. At one point, Reenie describes her great grandmother as her soulmate. And the first time we see Reenie in Texas, she's looking back across the Red River that separates Texas and Oklahoma and wondering if anybody's looking back. So I think Reenie especially is born with this sort of like this lack of connection to, she's left her culture behind as well. Her family, her grandmothers were her safe space, and gone to this new world that's quite volatile too, though in different ways. And so I think that Reenie kind of just comes up with a lack of rootedness. And we see that in her own decisions that really kind of follow for quite a while in like her heritage from her mother in terms of her choice of men and things like that. But I think that the weather, in a sense, reflects that, reflects the turmoil that they're going through, and that's building up for the end of the book. From the time we get to Texas, we start hearing about weather, and I think much more so than we ever did in the Oklahoma chapters. It becomes much more important as they're further removed from what they know and grandmothers and culture and family.
Yeah, I think obviously the female characters in both the novels. I appreciated how much we got to see into their thinking and their feelings and motivations. And something you mentioned, Kelli Jo, is that you wrote it in stories, in terms of stories, and you go back and each the title of each kind of sets you up for what are we going to hear about. But Donna, you also wrote in parts, correct? So you were when you wrote your story, Tea by the Sea. At the last part, that's where we read Tea by the Sea. So I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about your the writing style and kind of why you chose to do it in that way. And I just want to remind participants that you are also welcome to submit questions through the chat feature, and we want to make sure we leave time for that as well. But all right, so Donna, would you like to go first, talk about that?
Sure. The structure was the last thing that came together for this particular book. When I set out to write it, I wanted to write a story that took place over a 24-hour period. And so I began with that moment where Plum discovers that Lenworth is in Brooklyn, and wanted to write a story where it started from that moment until 24 hours later when she walked away from that situation with him. And, in the revision process, one of the things that I discovered was that the story, because you had to learn and understand so much about what happened in the past, how we got to this point, that the story just, in some ways it felt stalled because I had to keep looping back in flashback to explain to readers what exactly happened. So I ended up shifting it and telling the story in a very different way. So instead of going from 24 hours to 17 years, and pretty much starting with the moment, the pivotal moment in both their lives. it's and I think it worked better. Definitely for the story, it just simply worked better that way. But one of the things that I think I wanted to do by doing it in sections is to really show, in some ways, the changes in both of their lives. Plum's change from the very first moment when she discovered that Lenworth had taken their child to the life that she had in New York, in some ways sort of giving up and going on to having a life with a new family, and then again having that new life disrupted by Lenworth's possible return. And I think that too mirrors our lives. I mean, there's so many different sections. We don't live one continuous, I mean, we do, but our lives don't feel that it's, like just one continuous stream. It's broken up into little sections. We move, we have different things that happen in our lives that really change and shape who we are.
Absolutely. Kelli Jo, what about your style and kind of how you approached it?
Yeah, I love what you said, Donna, by the way, that sort of it reflects the way that we experience our lives. I like that a lot. But so for me, I feel like I'm a short story writer at heart. And I tend to get paralyzed if I think of big projects, for one thing. But I never wanted to really, for a long time, I didn't even expand my mind to imagine that I was writing a book. I was trying to write one short story at a time, like do it, and I'm thinking of art stories. I studied with Alan Chuse a lot at George Mason, and I always had Alan in my ears. I was trying to, really perfect one story. And then I would finish the story and move to the next one. But it turned out they kept coming from the same places, the Cherokee Nation in North Texas, the small North Texas town. And then eventually they were coming from the same family. And so I would just feel like I was a really slow learner to kind of listen to the story that for some reason I was being compelled to tell. I'd been writing the stories for a long time. One of the stories, the earliest story in the book in terms of when it was written, came from my time at Mason. In a workshop there. But I had stories that take place in terms of the chronology of the family that take place much earlier, when the great-grandmother was a girl in an orphanage. So for me, it became a matter of figuring out what the most compelling, broader narrative was that I wanted to craft out of all this work that I had. And a lot of that was figuring out where to start. And then once I figured out my start, which is a story called Book of Generations. I had to figure out, as a novel in stories, what gaps in time, or in some case, perhaps, tangents would the readers be comfortable with, and how could we ease those transitions, and where did I need to write a new story to fill in? So it just came about as a result of me just continually writing without looking too far ahead, until suddenly I looked behind me and said, oh, here's a book, and it's different than a collection of short stories, which is what I imagined. If I dare to imagine that I was writing a book, that's what I would have thought I was writing.
Well, what I really think that by doing that, and I'm going to forget some of the characters' names, but when the mentally disabled boy and his mother died, in the house, and then the ladies moved in, up the hill, I felt like that was a parallel story to what was going on. And it gave me, just a broader view into what life was like just in that community overall, and then at the end, they came back. And I really enjoyed that, the way you told that story. So you what I'm, the part I'm talking about, right? Where it's like I snippet into their lives, and then, yeah.
For sure. And I'm so glad to hear that, because we went back and forth on including that versus not including it. To take it out, it would be more of a tighter, a smaller, lens focused on Justine and Renee and their family. But I always did feel like, because, the story started as writing stories from the same places. And to me, it felt like a story about place as much as people. And I feel like these people are very affected by the very land that they come from. And, so I'm glad that worked well for you. We went back and forth, and then we just we decided to include it, and I felt like it enriched the story as well, and I like stepping back for a bigger view. Thank you.
Yeah, good. Well, and you mentioned like this, if you we look at the covers of both the books, yours and Donna's, they're pretty different. They take place in very different communities, but they're also both, you share a lot about the culture, of the both in Jamaica, and then also kind of what it's like to be in that Cherokee nation. And I think the covers kind of nail like what you might envision, like the spirit of the hardships and the just kind of what they were going through. So I'm just checking to see. I don't think we have any questions yet from the audience, but I do want to hear maybe a little bit more from you as the authors, just kind of about why you felt these stories were important to tell. Kelli Jo, would you mind going first?
No, I don't know that I ever stopped to think whether or not they were important stories to tell. I did feel like they were just sort of like a coming forth. They were going to come. And now that they're here, like, I really do. I feel like it's important that, we talk about own voices stories. And I think it's important that people from all kinds of cultures, Native cultures, get to tell our stories and, as we experience them, and not telling them for sort of a white American audience who doesn't have any experience with, living near reservations or, other living near Native people, like without the explainers, if that makes sense. I think should get to tell love stories and mysteries and crimes and thrillers and all of those stories without needing to say, hey, this is our culture and this is what it means to live in this land, as a Native teenager. Like, it is about culture and loss and intergenerational trauma and all of these things that comes with the experience, I think, of being Native in this country. But it's just a story about mothers and daughters. And I think it's important that young Native writers get to see that too, and don't feel a pressure to need to speak for my people now. No, just tell your story and work at your craft. Yeah. And I think that we're getting more space for that, and that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, and we do have a question that maybe will feel it, kind of relate to the answer, Donna, that maybe you'd like to share some comments. And it's about what writers inspire you, and were there books while you were working on your own novel that just that you were reading to influence, inspire your work?
When I was writing Tea by the Sea, the book that I think I had read not very long before and I kept coming back to was Ghana Must Go. And I can't remember her name, the author's name right now. But one of the things that I loved about that story was just simply how wide it was. It begins with a father who has had a heart attack, and he is dying when we meet him. At least we're told that he's dying, but his death sort of takes place over probably 50, 60, 70 pages, because you go back and forth to so many different pieces of his life, like how he came to where he was there in Ghana, the fact that his family wasn't there with him, and then we shift from his section to the family coming back together, and you're learning a lot of bits and pieces about this entire family throughout the story. And what I loved about that was just how wide ranging it was. It was just a very simple story about about a father's death and you know, the children and the ex-wife coming together after he has died. But the breadth of the story, you know, it took you to a lot of different places. It talked about culture, but wasn't necessarily overbearing in terms of this is a story. You know, it didn't come to you with a banner that says this is a story about Africa, this is a story about our culture. It just simply was a story. And I think, you know, a quite enjoyable story as well. And I think that, you know, just like Kelli Jo, that's exactly what I think so many of us writers want to be allowed to do. You know, for me as a Jamaican writer, I mean, I want to be allowed and I want to just simply tell stories. I don't want to be, you know, pigeonholed into writing the story about colonialism. I mean, yes, it affects our lives and it's going to be a part of all of our stories, but I don't think that it needs to come with that blaring headline that just simply says, this is a story about immigration, this is a story about colonialism. It is, you know, part of the story because it is our story, but it's not the only story that we can tell. And all of our stories don't need to be packaged in those kind of boxes. So I think, you know, we're shifting away from that. And I think more writers are certainly telling those broader stories and just simply telling stories, whether it's a, you know, it's a love story, that's what it is. But your culture is certainly going to be part of it.
Thank you. And Kelli Jo, were there any writers that specifically that inspire you, or any particular book that you would say, you know, you've read that that influenced you?
Oh, for sure, absolutely. I mean, Love Medicine was like the book that I went back to again and again because I think that one, Erdrich is just a master of anything she does. I think, you know, the short story and that Love Medicine is a novel in stories, and you can take any story in that book and pull it apart as just like an art story and appreciate it as a complete movement, beauty and characterization there, plot. But when you piece them all together, it just tells this beautiful, bigger narrative of place and two families. And so I really went back to that book so many times, and will continue to. I think it's a book you could take something else away from it every time you read it. So I read that and other you know, linked collections and novels and stories. Dylan Landis, Normal People Don't Live Like This, was also something that I went back to quite a bit. It's more of a linked collection, but I don't know. I think that it walks that novel and stories line, but it takes place in the late 70s in like Lower East Side Manhattan, but it's you know, so it's like worlds apart from the places and people I was writing about, but it's about a teenage girl and her group of friends and her family, and I just it's, you know, it's another lovely collection.
Thank you. We do have a question for Donna, and this is about a theme that comes up in both of your books. I'm just going to read the question. The loss of children is a theme that crops up in both of your books. Can you talk about this?
Yeah, for some reason I seem to be writing about a loss of children, and I keep trying to get away from it, but it keeps creeping back in. You know, I think I come from a place where I, you know, wrote an essay about this. And, you know, I remember having a conversation with my mother sometime back. I probably was in a few years back. And one of the things, you know, she was telling me that, you know, she didn't meet her mother until she was 12 years old. And, you know, and at that point when her mother came to visit, she was raised or living with her aunts. And, you know, her mother came to visit and she had no idea who this person was. And then, you know, her aunts told her who she was. And I think in some ways I feel like I want to understand, you know, like what that was like for her, growing up with, you know, like not knowing who her mother was, finding out later on that her mother also had 3 sons, but she raised her sons, but she didn't raise her daughter. And, you know, I think in some ways that, that has lingered. It's not necessarily my story. My mother was there in my life. My father was there. Like I, grew up with both parents, but for some reason, I think sometimes that the things that happen to, like whether our parents or grandparents, trickles down in some ways in our lives and in the stories that we tell about ourselves and how we understand ourselves. So I think I am in some ways still trying to understand that story, understand my mother through telling these various stories about loss and about mothers who either don't raise their children or the children who grew up without those mothers.
Yeah, I agree. The spoken word and stories are vitally important, as much as the written word. And I think both of you were able to bring in the culture in just an ordinary way. Like you're saying, you were just telling the stories, but they happen to be eating something different for breakfast, or they happen to be wearing something different. And so I think that was, I'm glad to hear that own voices and that the writers are able to tell these stories more and more now. So another audience question, this is for both. Can you talk more about place? What was the importance of place in your novels? And do you think we are losing our connection to place with so many people moving frequently and many being far from family these days? Any initial thoughts? Maybe I might put Donna on the spot since she traveled probably a little further. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I do. One of the things, the story is set in Jamaica. The portion in Jamaica, or place in Jamaica where the story is set, is a place called Anchovy, which is where my father grew up. And I actually set that piece of the story in my grandparents' house. And one of the things that we learn in the very beginning is that when Lenworth gets to that house, it is quote unquote abandoned, or it looks abandoned because the family members who own it have already migrated, and so the house has just been sitting there, which is why he's able to move in and live in that house. And my grandparents' house is still there; it's still in the family, but it is. We're at that place where my father and his siblings are getting up there in age, and their question that they continue to ask is, what is going to become of this place? And it's something that they want to sell. And so, for us, both for me, for my family, and for Jamaicans in general, for people from the Caribbean, from Africa, from wherever it is that we're migrating from, there is, for a lot of us, family land, family property that is sitting there that is probably going to be lost to, the remaining generations. So in some ways, I wanted to try to preserve that house, and by setting the story there. It's, it means a lot to me, like this place that my grandparents bought and built. I mean, largely because they, like my grandparents were born in late 1800s. That's not very far removed from slavery. And for them to be able to own property, to have property, to want to leave something to their children means a lot. And to want to preserve it in some ways is, it's just something that I wanted to try to do.
Well, and I know, Kelli Jo, you mentioned it covered 4 generations of mothers and daughters. And so maybe you could speak a little bit about kind of, that was a situation where they were staying together, maybe at least for, part of it.
Yeah, so I guess I see that they were staying together, and that's sort of where the strength came from. But it's a, an act of survival is an act of necessity, and so I think they got really close as a result. And then needing to leave as a different act of survival stretch those bonds in a great way. That's what the book is about, but that's what we see each of the younger generations doing in the book. First, Justine needs to leave, trying to make a better life. And then Renee, growing up in Texas, she does the same thing. And so thinking about the audience question, like, are we losing something? I think absolutely. we're losing something. By the end of the book, Rini is, living in Idaho, calling her mother over and over and over, trying to make sure she's okay during these weather events. But so we're losing something, but that's sort of what we're, when it's a matter of survival, I think that is what it comes down to. I in some ways, like thinking back to colonialism, it's continuing, like they're coming from extreme poverty for a reason there in the Cherokee Nation. It's by design that these women were not really able to survive. So much has been broken. And so, like breaking up of the family was kind of, again, by design. And that's what we saw enacted in these families' lives. And so much is lost. Like at the end of the book, we see, again, Rini is calling her mom. At that point, she's in Oregon. So she's become like even more of a sort of living more of a transient life. As she goes to college, the more she does, like the further she gets, she's disconnected from the land and family back home. But she is making a better life, but not in every way, I guess. But she's calling her mom, asking for like Cherokee stories, wanting to connect to this culture that she feels like she has an emptiness inside. Like she feels like she's lost something, and her mom is just like, I have stories I could tell you, but I don't know that you really want to hear them. They're not the kind of stories that you're thinking of, maybe. But so yes, absolutely, things are lost and gained, I suppose.
I still feel like I was left with hope at the end of both of your novels. So just the way you left it, just kind of empowered these female characters to continue leading their lives. And I know we could probably go off on another discussion about the male characters in the novels, but I am conscious of the time, and don't want to run too much over the time we've been allotted, and just to make sure there aren't any other audience questions. And I do hope that we no more questions. So that we see more from you soon. And I thoroughly enjoyed both of your books. And I'm just going to let everybody know there are a few more weeks left in the Fall for the Book events. And I encourage you to, if you haven't yet read these two novels, you will be glad you did, and I appreciate getting to know both of you through this session. And so everybody read on, and I'm going to turn it back to our facilitators. Thank you, ladies, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jen and Donna. It's really great talking to you both.
Good talking to you too.